Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Fall 2023 Roundtable event, Challenging Board Behavior and How to Manage It. As those of us who have been board leaders know, just one problematic board member can significantly disrupt the whole group, adversely affecting a board's productivity and decision-making. This typically costs the organization both time and money. Problematic board behavior can occur with an individual director, with groups within the board, such as with committees, or interest groups that may form, or across the full board itself. And bad board behavior is far more prevalent than you might expect. In fact, a recent Price Waterhouse Conference Board survey of 550 public company C-suite executives indicated that 89% of those surveyed believed that at least one of their company's board members needed to be replaced. That's a big number. Today, with the help of 4 seasoned FLG partners, all of whom have been CFOs and board members, what we're going to do is explore the challenges of problematic board behavior and when to call it out. We'll also provide interesting real-life company stories about dealing with it, and we'll lay out solutions for what boards can do to work more effectively as a leadership body and what CFOs can do to help with those solutions. Our panelists today include Sandy Gardner, Jeff Kuhn, Ron Fior, and Ken Chow. So welcome, panelists, and let's start the conversation. So we all know that strong board performance begins with recruiting the right team, right, everyone? But what happens to board productivity and performance when poor or unqualified candidates are selected? Ken, let's start with you. I know you've seen this happen. How do you manage through this situation?
Well, thanks, Lorraine. I've seen this situation a couple of times. At one of my clients, we had a board member who was ready to retire and with no successor in place. And so a junior analyst was assigned to take the board role, which frankly was just way beyond his capabilities. In another case, a new board member was brought in who was really unfamiliar with the industry and the nuances of our business and the rules around revenue recognition. And so these types of situations aren't ideal, but I found the best way to manage to address them is really to address the gap in knowledge on the part of the board member and to help them really rapidly come up the learning curve. I just had an example of this. The Section 174 of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed by then President Trump. This affects the timing of the utilization of R&D tax credits, which can push an unprofitable startup company into a taxable situation. And this is really pertinent for the startup ecosystem. Right. So I'd arranged a meeting with the audit committee, our CEO, our finance team, as well as our outside tax accountants to really ensure that everyone was up to date on the issue. So your job really, I think, for all board members, is to make sure they all have the tools, the knowledge, and the understanding of the company's past, present, and projected financial performance in order to enable them to be successful board members.
I could not agree with you more. I've served on 6 public company boards, and what I will say is all board members need to receive both onboarding in-house with the company as well as external education. And that could be anything from Stanford Directors College, which is every year in June, or taking classes with NACD, but completely agree with you. Another challenging issue, Ken, that I've personally witnessed is the passive-aggressive behavior in a board member. And this can be destructive, as you know, to board collaboration. So in your experience, Ken, how does a chair best handle this type of board member? What works?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've experienced, sort of a non-collaborative, passive-aggressive and even antagonistic type of behavior on the part of board members. Sometimes board members are brought on who have the right investor credentials or networks, but aren't necessarily a great personality or don't have a great management style. And so I think my approach really in dealing with these types of difficult personalities, sometimes you can consider them, difficult, is really to kill them with competence. And what I mean by that is these personality types are often by nature highly skeptical, So if you can really work to turn them by demonstrating competence and over communicating and being really proactive in addressing the issues in advance, you can kind of clear the minefields a bit in most cases. Let me give you one quick example. I had a very challenging board member at a company that I was working with who was very combative to deal with on many levels. And the board member wanted to challenge on how we recognize revenue based on we had a usage-based subscription. And he asserted that we could recognize revenue ratably. Mm-hmm. And I explained that according to 606 and the guidance, and based on the way the contracts were written, that would be difficult. So this board member, neither CFO nor CPA, wanted to sort of pick a fight on and instead of deferring to guidance. And I just had to handle it very matter-of-factly, and we ultimately recognized revenue as I had stated. It's situations like this that requires a lot of patience and ensuring you have your facts straight. I think the biggest thing that you have to make sure is you have to stay calm and collected and just don't surprise any board members.
Could not agree more. Staying calm and yes, no surprises, I think, for our audience just kind of says it all when it comes to working effectively as a CFO with a board and killing with competence. So I can also share an illustrative story. So about 25 years ago, I was a public company CFO at a med tech company, and I had a board audit chair who just wanted to prove me incompetent. I come from a legal background. He thought, what is she doing as our CFO? And unfortunately, the board was weak and kind of allowed that bad behavior. But what I did was, just to your point, figured him out, outperformed in every way I possibly could. And particularly when at the end of our tenure together, we negotiated what was then the biggest med tech deal in history, and the value of his options was 15 times what his original option value was. And then, of course, he became my new best friend. So the moral of the story is stay calm, figure the situation out, and honestly kill with competence when you're dealing with that kind of a board member. Let's turn to Jeff now. And Jeff, you've served many times as a public company CFO and board member. What other ideas have you seen that work well in reining in problematic board personalities?
Well, pardon me, the first step is to prevent them from getting on the board in the first place, which requires extensive reference checking and interviewing. Pardon me. In other words, do your diligence. But if they subsequently develop into a problem personality, the board chair or the audit chair in his or her stead must sit down with the problem board member and have a very direct and clear discussion about standards of proper behavior and comportment. And if the bad behavior persists, it's time to have a final warning meeting with outside counsel present. I've also seen professional counselors engaged to mediate these discussions. It's a rare group of people who can be completely candid with each other without lingering resentments. So a great solution I've seen work well, pardon me, is annual anonymous 360 reviews for all board members. But just note that this work should ideally be done by outsourced professionals and not a member of the board. And these professionals do this work for a living. This is a good way for a chair to flag problems before they're actually in a board meeting, witnessing a problem in real time.
I completely agree, Jeff. It's rare when you have a board chair that really has mastery in running meetings extremely well. When I was on the board at Cadence, we had a master class chair in Cam Gardner who could flag issues on the board faster than anyone, particularly if they were behavioral issues. But again, that's rare. So I like, Jeff, the idea of the annual 360s and outsourcing professionals who can manage that process and work with the chair on figuring out solutions to those kind of behavioral issues. Let's turn to Sandy. And one of the most frequent issues that I've seen personally on boards that I've been on is that unengaged board member, right? The guy or gal who skips a lot of meetings, sometimes because they're on too many boards. They rarely have prepared for the meeting. They're glued to their smartphone during the meeting. And then what happens is they ask a question out of the blue and then disrupt things. So Sandy, in your experience, what are the repercussions of such behavior and how should a chair deal with that situation?
Well, yes, Lorraine, you are correct. This can really cause problems on a board. For example, it becomes very difficult to schedule board and committee meetings when one member is overboarded and sits on too many boards. And this is particularly difficult with public company boards, since all of these companies are scheduling around the same quarterly and annual reporting timelines. Unengaged directors also create issues for the management team, who must jump into preparing for ad hoc board huddles. Unengaged board members are often the most unprepared and for board meetings, and therefore the board meetings become highly inefficient. Too much time is spent repeating relevant key metrics over and over again that have been presented in multiple previous meetings. These could be such things as operational challenges, the company's competitors, customers, cash runway, etc. Meetings should really be focused on new information and providing key updates to the board.
Absolutely.
And frankly, there should be an expectation, I think you mentioned this, the board members have reviewed the pre-read materials in advance of the meeting. So, and that's of course, as long as it was sent in ample time to do so. Typically, that's about a week, but at least a few days to give them time to review the information. In my opinion, the best strategy a chair can employ for the unengaged board member is twofold. First, the chair should be proactive and schedule the subsequent year meetings within the fourth quarter of each year to avoid that last-minute scheduling and scheduling conflicts, because then the schedule is well known in advance to all members. And then second, the chair can employ a mandatory maximum number of board meetings a member can be excused from per year.
I completely agree. I think a great chair needs to keep the meeting moving and actually run the meeting. You see a lot of chairs who typically don't run the meeting, and that's where sometimes there can be issues. I've seen great chairs. I mentioned Cam Gardner. Doug Gottschall is another phenomenal chair. And then I've seen other types of directors. Sometimes they may be younger companies with VCs or associates of VC firms on the board. And sometimes they may be on their computer. They're not necessarily listening or being present in the discussion and that sort of thing. So I think you're absolutely right. A chair needs to keep a meeting moving and run it. So let's turn back to Jeff. And on the flip side, Jeff, I know and have seen boards with weaker governance structures, and that they sometimes suffer due to board members being unwilling to step down, even when they've outworn their value to the board. Directors who might be aging out, or friends of the CEO who are not necessarily of great long-term value to a board. What works in these types of situations?
Well, I in particular recall attending a large NACD best practices session on board turnover and revitalization. This particular issue being highlighted as a real problem. In fact, one public company director who was speaking on the panel shocked the audience by saying, with some pride, that he had been on his board for 40 years.
Crazy.
I know, completely antithetical to fresh thinking by directors. So good board governance around time-limited board tenures and succession planning is really a surefire way to stop this from becoming a problem on the board. This is particularly important because removing a director is tough. Terms of public company directors are specific and renewed only by shareholder approval at annual meetings, though this can sometimes come down to a proxy fight. However, in private companies, directors are not always term limited and may serve at the pleasure of the major equity owner. So changing directors often comes down to a whim of the major equity owner, or the company's bylaws. In contrast, in VC companies, venture-backed companies, director seats are determined by the terms of the investment agreement for a given equity round, with the VC firm entitled to X number of seats on the board with the right to swap individuals from his or her firm if desired. And this can include individuals with observer rights, but without voting rights. It also matters whether the board member you want to remove is an investor versus an independent director, because independent directors do not necessarily carry the clout of an investor, in fact, rarely do.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's not unusual for new investors negotiating a significant investment, particularly in a down round, to demand control of the board as a precondition of investment. Bottom line is that you need to have legal counsel to give you good advice here when these conversations need to occur. Don't do it on your own.
Completely agree with you, Jeff, and a very good cautionary tip for the audience, right? Which is that you definitely want your general counsel or your outside counsel involved, because removing directors is not an easy thing to accomplish. Now let's move to Ron Fiora and get you into the conversation, Ron. So I know you've witnessed as a CFO other cases where a board member appears to just rubber stamp the views of another influential board member or chair. We call that the follower personality, right? So tell us a little bit about what you've seen in your work in terms of reining in this type of behavior.
Yes, indeed. It's really an interesting situation. I mean, some boards, they really do take on the role of followers, and they rarely express an independent view about board matters. These are the type of directors that automatically agree to anything that a certain other board member, there's usually one or two other influencers, whatever they say, whether it's correct or not. What I've seen as particularly helpful here is to just recognize this pattern in the board member behavior is unlikely to change. So what do? I leverage this knowledge, and by making sure the CEO and we always have a pre-meeting with the influencer, making sure they understand all the issues associated with the topic at hand, and then get them on board. I've seen us work on exec comp issues. I worked on business direction issues and a lot of other areas. I know it's a bit cynical, but really you're not going to change this behavior. So understand it and just take advantage of that knowledge.
Could not agree with you more. And these are great points for our audience, which is identify the behavior. And if the board member is an influencer, use that knowledge and leverage it. Right, Ron? Totally agree.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So let's turn to Jeff again. And a related issue, Jeff, is board directors that play politics. We've seen this in a lot of cases. Sometimes they have their own agendas and form coalitions behind the scenes to influence board meetings and decisions and votes. And sometimes, right, Jeff, it can be a good thing. Like, for instance, Ariana Huffington was that influencer who formed the right coalition to remove Travis from the Uber board. We all know about that. But sometimes, right, forming a coalition can be really not a good thing. So, Jeff, how does a chair deal with this kind of political gamesmanship, so to speak?
Well, this happens pretty often in my experience. Some degree of politicking is natural and comes with the territory and needn't be malevolent, but a strong board chair should always know the board vote on a matter before the meeting. Everything
Absolutely.
from discovery to discussions should happen before the meeting with perspectives vetted with pre-baked vote tallies. In essence, the board meeting is a ratification of committee and one-on-one decisions that have been made prior to the board meeting. Being aware of hidden collaborations or coalitions that could sabotage the final outcome is paramount for the chair. And that responsibility belongs to the chair, and a savvy board chair will be all over this proactively.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we've all spent a lot of time wasted on votes on proposals during board meetings that are a surprise. There should be no surprises in board meetings, period.
Completely agree. It's so key for the chair and committee chairs to be proactive and in sync, right, before the board meeting to ensure that things go smoothly. And also, right, Jeff, in sync with the CEO.
You bet.
Absolutely. Let's turn to Sandy, and I know you have been a board member and CFO at several companies. So what have you seen in your tenure, Sandy, regarding bad board behavior? For example, when a board member or members get too involved with the operations of a company.
Well, Lorraine, one situation we never like to experience as CFOs is when a board member gets too operationally engaged with the company, like you just mentioned,
Oh, yeah.
rather than focusing on governance. Frankly, this can become both awkward and uncomfortable for everyone involved. These board members often feel like they can do a better job in operating the company, even though they're not involved in the day-to-day operations. And this results in a number of dysfunctional behaviors. For example, in general, a board member should not access the C-suite without first informing the CEO. Now, while a chair of the audit committee should have unfettered access to the CFO and the comp committee chair to the CPO, I'm sure all of us have had the situation where another board member thinks they can just call the CFO or the CMO or the CTO and go around the CEO. In these situations, to ensure end runs around the CEO don't happen, it's important for the C-suiters to communicate these approaches to the CEO. And then the CEO needs to discuss it with the chairman of the board. Even more inappropriate is when a board member feels that they can go directly to and make requests directly to any member of any employee in the company. And I've seen board members do this. And they're looking for detailed information and reports.
Oh, yeah.
And this happens particularly, I've seen it at commercial and manufacturing companies. So my recommendation here is that if there is any doubt in the company's leadership, a board should really make the decision to change the leadership, not consistently go around the CEO, which is disruptive to the entire organization, is not productive, and it really creates a culture of uncertainty within the organization.
I could not agree with you more. And another example from my own experience is when I was about 10 years ago, when I was a public company CFO, a board member called me and wanted certain information about what was going on with the C-suite executive, and it was an HR issue. And I was stunned that he was calling me, the CFO, about that kind of an issue. He was the audit committee chair, but also this was not something that we discussed in audit committees. So I asked him, have you spoken to the CEO? And he said no, and then proceeded to ask me for more information. And I said to him, it's really not my place to be disclosing that information to you. You need to talk to so-and-so. And then I immediately called the CEO and just said, hey, just wanted you to know so-and-so called me. And I think he's going to be calling you about this information that I certainly did not give him. So I think for our audience, it's really important to know, you don't want to be part of an end run of a CEO. That board person who is calling you, have him chat with the CEO about an issue that's really not in your purview, so to speak, as you had mentioned. And I think all companies, right, Sandy, need better rules, both procedures and processes about board members reaching into the organization for information, because in my own experience, it's pretty loosey-goosey and it can cause problems. So let's pivot a little bit on a different subject. And in addition to board members getting too involved in management's sphere of influence and line of authority, one other situation CFOs sometimes encounter is that misalignment on the board between the objectives of the board and that of management. If board members are investors, for example, this can sometimes distort their incentives to look out for their own interests versus those of the company. So getting back to you, Ken, I know you've seen M&A situations where this has played out. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen.
Well, let's face it, Lorraine, this is a really common issue when companies and board investors are looking for liquidity opportunities and exit strategies. So, for example, investors sometimes want to sell a company for the ROI on their investments when the management team just doesn't want to do that. Another situation is when investors aren't aligned with each other. As an example, the objectives of one group of investors, let's say a Series A early stage investor, can conflict with the interests of later stage investors, let's say a Series C investor. The Series A investor, for example, may be just fine with a lower valuation for by an acquirer versus the Series C investor who may want a much higher company valuation for the sale based on their higher cost basis of their investment. So the
Jeff,
CFO.
I'm sorry, you go ahead. No, you go ahead, Ken.
CFO just really needs to be really aware of these kinds of competing interests.
Jeff, I know you want to chime in here.
Well, look, VC boards can have very different dynamics because unlike public company board members who are there to represent all the shareholders, in a VC board, the board members are the shareholders and represent their funds investors. And each of these board members may have very different, powerful, and conflicting objectives to those of the other members of the board. In situations where board members will have different outcomes from M&A or funding events, especially when not everybody wins, that's when the long knives come out.
Exactly. And I know, Ken, you probably want to add here as well.
Yeah, I think as a CFO, you're really in a critical position in these types of situations. You've got to lay out all the facts, make sure the business case is well laid out for moving in whatever the strategic direction is. And your job really is to provide the information, the implications, the risks, upsides, and really make a recommendation around every scenario in a very unemotional way with a comprehensive perspective and a thoughtful decision-making framework. I've also seen in another situation where the board and the management teams are sometimes at odds about the type of exit strategy that makes the most sense, say via an IPO versus being acquired. In an IPO, the management team reaps huge benefits, of course, whereas they may see somewhat limited upside in an acquisition, depending on the economics and what's being offered. Investors need to understand that the management team needs concrete incentives to support an acquisition path. So a CFO can really play a key role here, working through the equity rounds and the structuring of the participation of option pools and other tools to help motivate a management team. The strong CFO really will teach and inform a board what really matters here for a management team.
I think those are great examples, Ken, and I do agree. Good examples of CFOs helping to realign investor and management team objectives around the right path to exit. So, good stuff for our audience. Ron, getting you back into the conversation, another challenging situation I've seen as a director is when a board member just ignores what has happened in past board meetings because they maybe don't want to be associated with a bad decision or course of action. Have you seen this, and what works in these types of situations?
Yeah, yes, Lauren, I've definitely seen this happen. I've seen it in less successful M&A, other situations where a new business direction didn't pan out, or a company's made a significant new product investment, and the actual results just don't play out as the board would have liked. Even though you've fully discussed the risks with the board associated with the move, and we've documented them all, they just want to ignore that. So some boards will try to deny that they were briefed on the risks and the downsides of a given course of action. I've seen that. They don't want to acknowledge any knowledge or shared responsibility of any of it. They just want to wash their hands and step away. If you have one of these types of board members, and you'll know it. My recommendation is that if you're planning to discuss a previously discussed decision that has not had the anticipated result, you provide the highlights of the previous discussions, the decisions in the pre-read, at least 24 to 48 hours, as was mentioned earlier by Sandy, in advance of the board meeting. And then in the board meeting, you make sure you bring it to everybody's attention, and you try to do it obviously in a nice way, but you definitely have to bring it to attention that, hey, here's all the backup for this. This is what we all agreed to in the past.
This could not agree with you more. This just happened to me recently as a board member on a pricing subcommittee. One of the board members didn't remember that the subcommittee discussed a particular price range in a deal, and he was adamant about it. We never discussed it, all of that. And what we had to do is say, actually, no, you're incorrect in a nice way. We turned back to the minutes, and which clearly showed that we had thoroughly discussed the pricing range in the prior subcommittee meeting, and he got that. So it just reinforces the point that it's also sometimes good to have counsel present at board committee and subcommittee meetings, because they do take the notes, and you can always turn back and look to see if a decision was made or whatever. So all good points, Ron. Let's pivot again, and going back to Ken, as we sometimes know, boards are just unwilling to address what's an elephant in the room, so to speak. So have you seen this happen, Ken? And what can a CFO do to mitigate against this occurring?
Yeah, that's a really good point here. Most boards that I've typically seen or worked with, they typically confront the issues head on. But every once in a while, you're going to encounter a situation where the board just doesn't want to confront an issue or get into it with a CEO or a management team. I was working at one company once upon a time where we were burning through a ton of cash due to several CEO mandated initiatives. So the board was really pretty unhappy about this and pulled me aside as the CFO and asked me to rein in the spending, but refused to actually address it with the CEO openly and put it on the agenda in the board meeting. And so it was difficult. I was in a difficult situation. I worked very hard to try and convince my CEO that we really needed to make the necessary adjustments in our spending. But unfortunately, he just wasn't going to move in that direction. And the board was also unwilling to confront him. So this was a bit of what I felt was a bit of a no-win situation from my standpoint. So after 6 months of really pushing this hard, I ultimately had to have the courage to resign. I just can't be party to, and I couldn't be party to, not doing my fiduciary responsibility. Interestingly enough, 3 months later, the CEO was gone. So
it happens.
Yeah, it does. And while it doesn't necessarily play out exactly how I would have liked, I think as a CFO, you've got to have the courage to make the right decision. And I believe as a CFO, you always need to be willing to stick to the facts and confront the realities of a company's financial situation, both with the C-suite and the board. Part of this is bringing the board up to speed on the issues and addressing it with the management team and really getting it on the board agenda. This might not make you the most popular, member of the C-suite, but it's a really important part of your job as a CFO.
Totally. I mean, a CFO is never the most popular person in an organization, but the job of the CFO is to be honest and work from facts, really well-drawn analysis, and always really to think about and do what's in the best interest of the company. So could not agree with you more.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Let's turn now to Sandy. And Sandy, I know, and I'm laughing a little bit because we've actually seen this together, but I know you're familiar with situations in which a controlling shareholder plays politics and becomes problematic in the effective functioning of the overall board and company. Describe what you have seen happen in these instances and how a board can try to mitigate the risk of that controlling shareholder having too much control.
Well, first, I think many people think that this might just happen in private companies, but it is just as prevalent in public companies. And playing politics seems to be a frequent issue on some boards. This occurs, for example, when a controlling shareholder will only consider adding members to the board who he or she has worked with in the past and thinks will agree with him or her on future issues. A controlling shareholder can also be disruptive by asking for too many meetings or too frequent a meeting schedule and demanding extensive reporting and operational details from management.
We've actually seen this together in terms of when you see a controlling shareholder trying to make decisions that are actually the purview of the CEO. And honestly, one needs to put that controlling shareholder in his or her place, but it's difficult, right? To call out that behavior. Hopefully there's another member of the board that can do that, but it's tough.
Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. And just as you said, we've seen this together. So a far too common occurrence is when board members don't want to disagree with or vote against a controlling shareholder. They sometimes do this when the company needs to raise capital and they think that rocking the boat will hinder the controlling shareholder's participation to lead future rounds of financing. And sometimes board members don't want to disagree or offer their perspective because they themselves are worried that challenging the controlling shareholder might put their own board income at risk. And this can be particularly worrisome if they are retired, right?
Absolutely.
And sometimes a controlling shareholder on a board can effectively eliminate the board's ability to view situations independently. For example, as I mentioned before, the timing in terms of a financing, including an IPO. I've also seen a number of cases where controlling shareholders were not willing to endure the short-term pain of focusing on and fixing key operational deficiencies for the longer-term betterment of the company. Now, the short-term pain I'm referring to may come into, form of additional capital investments, for example, like towards an ERP system to get a better handle on inventory and COGS, or maybe it's a temporary reduction of revenue to address product issues or sales force, realignment, or in the case of a public company, it may be a potential reduction in the market cap. In order to mitigate some of these risks, a strong board should implement a robust and structured board nominating and recruitment process, including a nominating committee made up of only independent members. An optimal board structure should also include setting a maximum time-limited board tenure. Jeff talked about this earlier. And just as important is to assess the nature and frequency of past working relationships among board members.
Completely agree. Boards and companies really need to do better due diligence in terms of bringing on the right board members. Absolutely. So clearly a lot of great lessons learned here today about proactive strategies for CFOs and board leaders to manage challenging behavior and motivations amongst board members. And I hope our audience has taken away some great nuggets today. Before we finish, we are going to go to the chat room because I see that we do have some Q&A. And I am going to state the question, and then please, panelists, go at it in terms of your answers. So the first question is, can you talk about what can be done when the problem board member is appointed by a VC who has the right to appoint a board member, especially if the behavior is not ethical or potentially illegal? Anyone wants to take that on, guys?
I'll take a stab at that. It's pretty unusual when you have VCs who do not know each other on the board. So what you need to do, I think, is the first step is to speak with the VC who knows the problem VC board member and use that person as really the intermediary to persuade this person offline to get back in compliance, if you will. There's not very much you can do about that person being on the board, right? And it was part of their investment agreement. So you have to apply real moral persuasion by his or her affiliates or friends or co-investors. Often these people co-invest together. And if the behavior is becoming unethical, going from unethical to illegal, you got to get company counsel involved right away. Now, I've never seen this happen personally from a VC, but don't hesitate to get counsel involved.
I could not agree with you more, Jeff. What I've seen is I've never seen behavior cross over to the illegal side of things, but I have seen behavior that is marginally ethical or perhaps not. And I think Jeff states it best, which is that's when you need to either speak to another influential member of the board to see if that behavior can be resolved within the board, or both. Get company outside counsel involved, and your general counsel if you have one. Very, very important. I think the same person, it's an anonymous attendee, is asking a follow-up question. And that is, what do you do if the challenging board member is the board chair or the AC chair, and they're talking in respect to a public company? Anyone wants to tackle that question?
The answer is you can't do very much at all. I mean, that's what the role is of an activist shareholder in a public board is. They're there to stir up the mud and really throw their weight around. But there's not very much you can do to get somebody off a board who's got, the shareholders behind them in the first election. You just have to find a way to put up with them.
Well, I think the other thing that I would add here is they may be the audit committee chair and board chair, as this individual is mentioning, but there are also other audit committee members that the CFO can, speak with. I mean, the CFO should be, communicating the facts and presenting at the meetings, and you can have, individual conversations with other members of the audit committee to just bring to light some of these challenges, and perhaps challenges that are not only affecting the board, but that has now infiltrated the C-suite and certainly the management of the company.
Right. In my experience, so if you have a problematic board member who's in fact the chair or the audit committee chair, what I would do in that situation if I was the CFO is I would absolutely have a conversation with my CEO, and in terms of trying to put together a plan. I would also have my general counsel involved in that conversation, and talking about potentially bringing outside counsel in to help mediate the situation, because of the fact that you're in a tough situation in terms of just doing it internally yourselves. But that's potentially a solution there.
Well, and I would just add, you've also got to have the backbone and the courage to do the right thing here.
Absolutely.
And address it. You can't just sweep that one under the rug.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It needs to be addressed. The last question is a question that I'll direct to Sandy, and that is with regard to Sandy. Have you seen situations where the chair and the CEO is the same person? I think we've all seen these kinds of situations. How have you in the past dealt with that?
Yeah, so first of all, I wouldn't recommend it that the chair and the CEO is the same, individual.
It's really not good governance.
It's not good governance, and it does take away some of the things that I spoke about earlier, just the true independence of the board, if it's the same individual. But I think it's just most important for the CFO to consistently show the data and the metrics of the performance of the business. Let that, the data, the facts speak for itself. And so, the other thing is that, the CFO, again, it goes back to the audit committee, but the CFO has direct access to the audit committee chair. So the CFO can have additional conversations with the audit committee chair regarding the business and the financial issues, and make it practice to have a pre-meeting with the audit committee chair a day or two before the audit committee materials are distributed, so that you're giving him or her the chance to preview the information. Maybe you strategize a bit about how it's presented, or what the topics really should be. So if you need to go gain additional information, and then that way there's, you're gaining alignment with the audit committee chair before going to the wider group.
Absolutely. Well, I think that wraps it up, everyone, with regard to our panel discussion today, and I hope our audience enjoyed it and got a lot of learnings from it. Someone did ask the question if we're recording this. The answer is yes. It will be put up onto our FLG YouTube channel, and I believe we'll also have this on our website. So I hope everyone enjoyed today's conversation, and please join us for future FLG Roundtable events. Thank you. Bye now.